The 19-year-old alien princess insulted the human, so he struck before walking away. Part 1. The Summit on Valindra Station. Valindra Station floated in the dark like a small city that someone had forgotten to attach to a planet. It hung in orbit above a massive orange gas giant, turning slowly, its long arms and docking rings catching the light of a distant star. Ships came and went from it all day and all night, and the corridors inside were always busy with creatures of every shape and color imaginable. The station was neutral ground. That was the whole point of it. No single species owned it, and no single species ran it. A council of 7 different civilizations managed its operations together, and they had done so for over 300 years. Every 10 years, the station hosted something called the Grand Conclave, a gathering of ambassadors, diplomats, trade representatives, and political figures from dozens of worlds. It was, by most measures, the most important diplomatic event in the known galaxy. Connor Dale had been briefed on every detail of the station before his ship even left Earth's orbit. He was a tall man, not particularly broad, with short brown hair and the kind of posture that came from years of military service. He had served in the Navy for 11 years before leaving to study international relations, and then interstellar relations, and eventually found himself sitting in briefing rooms talking about species that most people back home still thought of as science fiction. He was 38 years old, and he was the lead envoy of Earth's diplomatic delegation to the Grand Conclave. His 2 colleagues were with him as they walked through the main arrival corridor of the station. Kara Novak walked on his left. She was 31, quick-eyed, and had a natural ability to make anyone feel comfortable within about 60 seconds of meeting her. She had studied xenolinguistics and cultural communication, and she was, in Connor's private opinion, the best person he had ever worked with. Ethan Cole walked slightly behind them both, carrying a datapad and already scanning through briefing notes. He was 26, a little nervous in large crowds, but sharp in a way that consistently surprised people who underestimated him. The arrival hall of Valindra Station was enormous. The ceilings were high enough to make humans feel small, on which Connor suspected was entirely intentional. Delegates and their staff moved through the space in clusters, and the air carried the faint smell of chemicals and organic compounds that did not quite translate to anything familiar. 3 separate translation hubs were mounted along the walls, quietly processing and broadcasting conversations in real time. Connor kept his expression neutral and his pace steady. He greeted 2 Thorosi officials near the registration desk with a respectful gesture that Kara had coached him on during the flight. They responded warmly. The Thorosi were old allies of humanity, cautious but fair, and their ambassador, a tall, gray-skinned figure named Grell, had worked with Connor twice before at smaller diplomatic meetings. The official opening reception was scheduled for that evening in the Grand Hall, on a wide circular room on the station's upper ring that had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out into open space. The gas giant below glowed orange and gold through the glass, and the room was lit softly so that every delegate could be seen clearly without anyone being uncomfortable. Connor arrived in the Grand Hall with Kara and Ethan a few minutes before the reception began. He was wearing the formal diplomatic uniform of the Earth Interstellar Service. Dark blue with simple silver trim, nothing flashy. He had been told many times that his presence was not imposing enough for galactic politics, and every time he had quietly disagreed. He was not there to be impressive. He was there to be effective. The Velhari delegation arrived last. That was a known habit of theirs. It was a status move, and everyone in the room understood it as such. The Velhari were one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in this part of the galaxy. Their empire stretched across 41 star systems. Their technology was advanced, their culture was ancient, and their opinion of younger species ranged from mild curiosity to open contempt, depending on the individual. Princess Seraphine Valeth entered the grand hall between two tall guards in ceremonial armor. She was, by any measure, striking in appearance. Velhari were humanoid in shape, but not in detail. Their skin carried a faint blue-silver sheen, their eyes were large and a pale gold color, and they moved with a kind of deliberate grace that looked almost practiced. Seraphine was 19 years old, though she carried herself as though she had been ruling for decades. She wore formal robes of deep violet and silver, and her expression as she entered the room was exactly the expression of someone who had never once walked into a room and felt out of place. Protocol required that the lead envoys greet one another at the start of the reception. A station official guided Connor across the room toward the Velhari delegation. He was introduced by title and name. He bowed his head at the appropriate angle. Kara had been very specific about the angle. And he offered the traditional greeting phrase in the common galactic tongue, which his translator rendered smoothly. Seraphine looked at him, not with curiosity, not with even the baseline courtesy that diplomatic protocol required. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are mildly annoyed to find on their doorstep. But she looked him up and down once, slowly, and then she said something. She said it loudly. Not shouting. She was too composed for that, but loud enough that the nearby delegates heard it clearly. The translation feed carried it to those further away. She said that humans were like domesticated animals who had learned to imitate diplomacy by watching others do it. And she said that Connor, specifically, looked like the kind of creature her family kept at their palace for tending the grounds. The room went quiet. Not completely. There was still the soft background noise of the station, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of a ship docking somewhere. But the people near them stopped talking. Heads turned. A Thorosi delegate near the window lowered his drink. Even Seraphine's own senior advisor, Chancellor Dorveth, went very still. Kara Novak, standing 2 steps behind Connor, did not move. Ethan Cole stopped reading his datapad. Connor did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not change his expression immediately. He simply stood there and let the moment exist for exactly as long as it needed to, while every set of alien eyes in the nearby vicinity waited to see what the human would do. And then, very quietly, Connor Dale began to speak. The 19-year-old alien princess insulted the human. So he struck before walking away. Part 2. The strike heard across the station. The quiet in the grand hall had a particular texture to it. It was not the comfortable silence of a room at rest. It was the sharp, held-breath silence of a room that was paying attention. Yet dozens of delegates from dozens of worlds had stopped their own conversations and turned, some subtly and some not at all subtly, toward the spot near the center of the room where a human envoy was standing in front of a Velhari princess who had just publicly compared him to a garden worker. Connor Dale did not raise his voice. He did not straighten up with exaggerated pride or clench his jaw or do any of the things that Seraphine had perhaps expected from a younger species representative whose dignity had just been stepped on in front of everyone. He simply spoke, calmly, clearly, in the common galactic tongue so that every translation feed in the room could carry it without difficulty. He said that he understood the princess was perhaps not fully briefed on humanity's current standing in the galactic community. And he said this without sarcasm, in the tone of a man offering a correction rather than an argument. Then he began to speak about facts. He said that in the past 200 years, since humanity had first reached the stars, they had survived 3 separate extinction-level events. The first was a catastrophic asteroid impact on Earth's northern hemisphere that killed nearly 400 million people and still did not stop human expansion into space. The second was a biological crisis that spread through 2 early human colony ships and wiped out everyone aboard, after which humanity rewrote its entire quarantine and biosafety protocol in under 3 years. The third was an armed conflict with a species that no longer existed, partly because humanity had chosen not to destroy them, and partly because in the end, the other species had made choices that humanity could not prevent. Connor said all of this without drama, as though he were reading from a history textbook. Then he continued. He said that roughly 8 years ago, a Velhari military vessel had been destroyed in a border skirmish near the Karath Expanse, and some of its wreckage had drifted into unclaimed space where a human salvage team had recovered it. The wreckage included partial components of a Velhari shielding system, technology that the Velhari had been developing for over 2 centuries. He said that the human engineering team had reverse-engineered the core principles of that shielding system in 8 months, not copied it, understood it, improved on 2 of its structural weaknesses, and built their own version of it from scratch. That he mentioned this not as a boast, but as a data point. Then he said one more thing. He said that humanity was currently the only species in the known galaxy producing agricultural surpluses large enough to export food aid to 2 other civilizations at the same time, both of whom were experiencing serious crop failures on their colony worlds. He paused for just a moment. Then he said that one of those 2 civilizations was a Velhari frontier colony in the Aldrin system. A colony that had quietly submitted 3 requests for external food assistance in the past 18 months, all of which had been reviewed by Earth's Interstellar Aid Office. The grand hall was still. Seraphine had not moved. Her pale gold eyes were fixed on Connor with an expression that had started as indifference and was now something harder to read. Connor reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and produced a small flat device. A contract summary card, the kind used at diplomatic meetings to formalize preliminary offers. He held it up so she could see it. Then he said that the human delegation had come to Valindra Station prepared to offer the Velhari Empire a long-term agricultural and medical trade partnership. He said the terms were favorable. He said it was the kind of agreement that both civilizations would benefit from for generations. He set the contract card down on the nearest table. Then he said quietly and without any visible emotion that the offer was withdrawn. He straightened the front of his jacket with one hand. He looked at Seraphine for exactly 1 more second, not with anger and not with contempt, simply with the clear, a level gaze of a man who had said everything he needed to say. Then he nodded once to the room in general and turned and walked away. The silence lasted. It lasted long enough that several delegates later described it as one of the more uncomfortable moments they had experienced at a diplomatic gathering. And those were people who had attended many such gatherings. Then Ambassador Grell of the Thorosi Collective began to applaud. He did it slowly and deliberately, the way a person applauds when they want everyone to understand exactly what they are applauding for. He was an old diplomat, and he had watched the Velhari dismiss smaller civilizations for decades, and something about what had just happened in front of him clearly struck him as worth acknowledging. A few others joined him, not everyone, but enough. My Seraphine did not move for a long moment. Then Chancellor Dorveth stepped close to her and said something very quietly near her ear, his expression tight with the particular look of a senior advisor who is trying very hard not to show that he is alarmed. He took her gently by the arm and guided her toward the far side of the room. Kara Novak fell into step beside Connor as he walked toward the exit corridor. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She just walked with him, and after a few seconds, she smiled, a small, private smile that she did not try to hide. Behind them, the grand hall slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed. Drinks were lifted again, but something had shifted in the room, the way air shifts before weather changes, and everyone present felt it even if they could not immediately name it. Ethan Cole caught up with them in the corridor outside, slightly out of breath, still holding his data pad. He looked at Connor. He looked at Kara. He said he was going to need a few minutes to process what had just happened. Connor told him he could have 10. Then they had work to do. He kept walking down the corridor at the same pace he had entered it, steady and unhurried, the quiet hum of Valindra Station all around them, the great orange gas giant glowing silently through every window they passed. The 19-year-old alien princess insulted the human, so he struck before walking away. Part 3. The Fallout and the Scramble. By the time Connor Dale reached his quarters that night, the story had already left the Grand Hall. That was the thing about Valindra Station. It was neutral ground, which meant that information moved through it the way water moves through a cracked pipe, quietly, quickly, and in every direction at once. The station had its own informal network of diplomatic observers, news traders, and information brokers who made their living by being present at exactly the right moments. What had happened in the Grand Hall was not the right moment. It was several right moments stacked on top of each other. By the time most delegates had finished their evening meals, the phrase, "the human walked away," had been translated into at least 9 languages and was circulating through the station's private communication channels. By the following morning, it had reached ships currently in transit to the station, carrying delegations who had not yet arrived. By midday of the next day, and it had been picked up by the broader interstellar information networks and was being discussed in places that had no direct connection to the Grand Conclave at all. Connor read the early reports over breakfast with Ethan, who had compiled them into a clean summary document. The coverage was, on balance, favorable to the human delegation. Several diplomatic commentary feeds described what Connor had done as a textbook example of controlled response. One Thoreausi commentary piece called it, "the most efficient diplomatic strike in recent memory, delivered without a single weapon." Connor read that line, set down his coffee, and told Ethan to archive it but not respond to any media inquiries. Ethan asked if he was sure. Connor said he was very sure. Engaging with the coverage would make it about them. It was not about them, and it was about the work. Kara Novak spent the morning in the station's open common areas, which were shared by all delegations and served as informal meeting spaces between scheduled sessions. She was doing what she was very good at, talking to people. Not negotiating, not pitching, just talking. She sat with a pair of junior delegates from a small civilization called the Veshtari, who had traveled a significant distance to attend the conclave and were clearly feeling a little overwhelmed by the size of the gathering. She asked them about their homeworld. She asked about their food, their climate, their history. She listened well, and she remembered details, and she laughed at the right moments. And by the end of the morning she had made 2 genuine contacts and laid the groundwork for what Ethan later described as an entirely unprompted friendship agreement that could be worth quite a lot in about 5 years. Connor attended the first official session of the conclave. He sat in the human delegation's assigned seats, listened carefully to the agenda proceedings, asked 2 precise questions during the open floor period, and said nothing unnecessary. Several delegates who had been in the Grand Hall the previous evening made a point of stopping by the human section before the session began. Not to say anything significant, but simply to nod or briefly make eye contact in a way that communicated acknowledgement. Connor received each of these small gestures with equal courtesy and moved on. Said the Velhari delegation arrived late to the session, which was normal for them. But Chancellor Dorveth's expression was not his usual composed political mask. It was tighter. He sat in the Velhari seats and spent most of the session reading from a private document rather than engaging with the proceedings. Princess Seraphine was not present at the morning session at all. That was noted by several observers. In the Velhari private quarters, things were considerably less calm. Dorveth had asked, then told, then finally demanded that Seraphine sit down and listen to him fully before saying a single word. She had agreed, partly because she had never seen him look quite the way he looked right now, which was like a man who had just watched someone accidentally drop a very expensive and irreplaceable object off a very tall building. He explained the situation to her. Not the diplomatic situation, the real situation. The Velhari frontier colonies were struggling. That was the polite way to say it. The more accurate way to say it was that 3 colonies in the outer systems were quietly running low on food, that the imperial agricultural supply network had been stretched to its limit by 2 consecutive years of poor harvests on the core worlds, and that the imperial court had made a deliberate decision not to make this information public because public knowledge of food insecurity within the empire would be politically destabilizing and would encourage the Velhari's rivals to test their borders. The human trade offer that Connor Dale had set down on the table and then taken back had not been a convenience. It had been, depending on how the next 6 months went, and potentially the difference between a quiet internal crisis managed behind closed doors and a very public crisis managed badly in front of everyone. And Seraphine, in front of every major delegation in the galaxy, had insulted the man holding it. Dorveth said all of this carefully and completely. Then he waited. Seraphine sat without speaking for a long time. The arrogance that she had carried into the grand hall the previous evening was still somewhere in her, but it was mixed now with something newer and less comfortable. The particular feeling of having done something irreversible and having understood too late exactly what it cost. She asked if there was a way to reapproach the humans through indirect channels without it appearing as a retreat. Dorveth told her that there was not, because every delegation on the station was watching closely, and any attempt to approach the humans indirectly would be interpreted exactly as what it was. He said that if there was going to be any path back to the table, it would have to begin with something direct, something honest, and something that came from her. Not from him, not from the Imperial advisors, but from her personally. Seraphine did not respond to that immediately. Back in the human quarters, 3 separate delegations had sent private messages to Ethan's communication channel asking whether the withdrawn trade offer might be redirected. Connor read each message twice. He was not interested in being spiteful, and he told Ethan clearly that he did not want to use the situation as an opportunity to embarrass the Velhari further. But he was also a diplomat, and his job was to serve humanity's interests. And the interest of 3 delegations reaching out at once was data worth taking seriously. He told Ethan to send polite acknowledgments and schedule preliminary conversations. Not commitments, conversations. Then he went back to preparing for the next session. And somewhere on the other side of Valindra Station, a 19-year-old princess sat alone in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had the day before. The 19-year-old alien princess insulted the human. So he struck before walking away. Part 4. The princess comes to the door. 3 days passed. Connor Dale attended every scheduled session of the Grand Conclave. He spoke when it was his turn to speak, asked questions when questions were useful, and sat quietly when they were not. He reviewed trade documents in the evenings with Ethan and spent portions of each afternoon debriefing with Kara about the informal conversations she had been having across the station. He ate his meals at reasonable times and slept for a reasonable number of hours and conducted himself in every observable way as a professional doing his job at a large diplomatic gathering. He did not bring up what had happened at the reception, not once, not in any session, not in any corridor conversation, not in any private meeting. He did not reference it, he did not hint at it, and when 2 separate delegates made indirect comments designed to invite him to comment on it, he acknowledged them politely and redirected the conversation to whatever was actually on the agenda. Ethan found this somewhat remarkable and said so. Connor told him it was not remarkable. It was just discipline. The incident had made its point on its own. Repeating it would only shrink it. The other delegations noticed. The Thorosi noticed especially. Ambassador Grell stopped Connor after a session on the third day and told him, in the particular formal way that Thoreausi expressed approval, that the human delegation's conduct over the past 3 days had been observed with considerable respect. Connor thanked him. Then he asked Grell about the Thoreausi's position on a proposed shipping lane adjustment that was coming up for vote the following morning. They talked about that for 20 minutes instead. Kara spent part of the third afternoon talking to a young Velhari aide she had encountered twice in the common areas. She was careful not to push or probe. She was just friendly. Because she was genuinely friendly, and she was genuinely curious about Velhari culture in ways that had nothing to do with politics. The aide, who had clearly been briefed to be cautious around the human delegation, gradually relaxed over the course of an hour. By the end of the conversation, she had told Kara 3 things about Velhari domestic traditions that Kara found genuinely interesting and that had nothing to do with the current situation at all. Kara mentioned the conversation to Connor that evening. He listened and said nothing particular, but he filed it away. On the 4th evening, Connor was in the human delegation's private meeting room, going through revised agricultural export numbers with Ethan. The room was small and practical. A round table, 4 chairs, a display screen on one wall, a window on the other that showed the dark curve of the gas giant below. It was about 2 hours before the station's designated rest period. There was a knock at the door. Connor looked at Ethan. Ethan checked his communication pad. He shook his head slightly. Nothing scheduled. Connor went to the door himself and opened it. Princess Seraphine Valeth was standing in the corridor alone. No guards, no advisors, no attendants. She was not wearing her formal diplomatic robes. She was wearing something much simpler. A dark gray garment without decoration. The kind of thing someone puts on when they are not performing a role and simply want to be a person. Her pale gold eyes were steady but not cold. She looked in a way that she had not looked at the reception 3 evenings ago. I'd like someone who was 19 years old and standing somewhere uncomfortable and had chosen to be there anyway. She said she would like to speak with him privately, if he was willing. Connor considered her for a moment. Not long. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. She came inside. Connor looked down the corridor both ways out of habit before closing the door. He gestured toward the table. She sat. He took the seat across from her. Ethan quietly gathered his things and excused himself without being asked, which Connor noted with appreciation. Connor poured a glass of water from the container on the table and set it in front of her without comment. She looked at it the way someone looks at an unfamiliar gesture, trying to understand the meaning before accepting the thing. Then she picked it up and held it. Connor folded his hands on the table and waited. She did not open with a formal statement. She did not produce a diplomatic phrase. She started to say something about her words at the reception having been imprecise, that they had not reflected the intended position of the Velhari delegation, that, strategically speaking, Connor interrupted her gently. He said he did not need the diplomatic version. She stopped. He said she could say what she actually meant if she wanted to. He said it simply, without pressure, the way you might say it to someone who had gotten into the habit of speaking in codes and had perhaps forgotten there was another option. There was a silence. It lasted long enough that the hum of the station's ventilation became audible. Then Seraphine said quietly that she had been wrong, and that she had spoken about him and about his species from a place of assumption rather than knowledge. That the things she had said were not true, and that even if she had believed them to be true at the time, saying them in that room in that way had been a poor choice. Connor listened without expression until she finished. Then he asked her one question. He asked her why she had said it, not what had motivated the Empire's political position, not what her advisors had told her about humanity. Why she, personally, Seraphine, had said it. She was quiet again. Then she said that she had grown up being told that the Velhari were the standard by which other civilizations were measured. That younger species were interesting in the way that growing things were interesting. Worth observing, occasionally worth helping, but not yet worth treating as equals. She said that she had never actually questioned this until 2 evenings ago, when a human envoy had stood in front of her and, without raising his voice or losing his composure, made her feel, for the first time in her life, that she had said something genuinely small. Connor was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said that humans had learned a long time ago, back when they were still only fighting each other on a single planet, that the loudest answer to an insult was not another insult. It was silence, followed by action. He said that anger was a resource, and spending it on someone who had not yet earned the full weight of it was a waste. He said it plainly, not as a lecture, but as an explanation. The way you explain something to someone who asked a real question and deserves a real answer. He said she was clearly not stupid. He said she was clearly not without ability. He said that from what little he had observed, she had a sharp enough mind to understand complex information quickly, which was not a small thing. And he said that whatever she had been taught about younger species, she was capable of evaluating that teaching against actual evidence. Because she had just done exactly that, sitting in this room tonight. He said that the difference between a ruler who was obeyed and a ruler who was followed was usually not power. It was whether the people around her believed she was capable of being wrong and willing to admit it. Seraphine set the glass of water down carefully on the table. She asked, after a moment, if the trade offer was truly gone. Connor leaned back in his chair and looked at her in the steady, even way that was simply the way he looked at things when he was thinking honestly. He said that depended entirely on what happened next. She nodded once, slowly, and stood to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back. She said that she was not certain she knew how to be the kind of ruler he had described. Connor told her that was probably a good place to start. She left without another word, and the door closed quietly behind her, and Connor sat alone in the small meeting room for a few minutes with the hum of the station around him, looking at the orange curve of the gas giant through the window, thinking. The 19-year-old alien princess insulted the human. So he struck before walking away, Part 5, A New Understanding and What It Costs. The final day of the Grand Conclave began like every other day on Valindra Station, with the slow mechanical turning of the outer ring, the distant sound of ships moving through docking channels, and the quiet routines of dozens of delegations preparing for whatever the day would ask of them. Connor Dale was awake early. He sat at the small desk in his quarters with a cup of coffee and the finalized version of 3 separate preliminary trade documents that Ethan had prepared overnight. He read through them carefully, marking 2 points for clarification and approving the rest. Then he set them aside and looked out the window at the stars for a while, which was something he did sometimes in the mornings when he needed to think without a specific subject, just think in the general direction of everything at once. Kara knocked on his door at 6. He let her in. She had already heard, through channels she declined to specify, but which Connor suspected involved the Velhari aide she had befriended and at least one Thorosi communications staffer, that something significant was being prepared by the Velhari delegation for the open remarks period of the closing session. She did not know what it was. She said it was possible it was nothing. She said it was also possible it was something. Connor told her to come to the session prepared for either outcome and to sit where she could see both the Velhari delegation and Ambassador Grell at the same time. She said she always did that already, and he said he knew. The closing session of the Grand Conclave convened in the main chamber, which was the largest formal gathering space on the station. It seated over 300 delegates, and had been designed to ensure that no species was placed physically higher than any other. Every seating tier was at the same distance from the chamber floor, arranged in a wide oval around the central speaking area. The lighting was even and clear, The translation feeds were running on all channels. The session moved through its scheduled items in the morning. Voting records were confirmed. Treaty amendments were logged. 3 new bilateral agreements were formally acknowledged and signed. Connor participated in 2 votes and abstained on a 3rd, which was a position he had held since the first day of the conclave, and which remained consistent with Earth's stated policy on the matter in question. The Velhari delegation was present and correct for the entire morning. Chancellor Dorveth sat in his usual seat, composed and unreadable. Seraphine sat beside him and said nothing during the formal proceedings, which was standard for her role as a royal representative rather than an active negotiator. Connor did not look at the Velhari section more than was natural. The open remarks period came after the midday break. It was a part of the closing session where any delegation could take the floor without a pre-submitted agenda item, a time for statements of intent, expressions of goodwill, or closing observations that delegates wanted formally entered into the conclave record. Most civilizations used it for brief, polished statements of a few minutes. It was rarely where anything unexpected happened. Seraphine Valeth requested the floor. The chamber took notice. A 19-year-old royal requesting open remarks, time was not standard procedure for any delegation, Velhari or otherwise. Dorveth's expression did not change, which meant he knew this was coming and had accepted it, or possibly had been told it was happening and had no remaining authority to stop it. She walked to the central speaking area and stood there for a moment before she began. Her voice was steady. She did not read from a prepared document. She spoke in the common galactic tongue, clearly enough for every translation feed in the chamber to carry it without difficulty. She said that she wished to address something that had occurred at the opening reception of this conclave. She said that at that reception, she had made remarks directed at the lead envoy of the human delegation. She said those remarks were based on assumptions rather than knowledge, and that they were wrong, and that they were not worthy of a representative of the Velhari Empire, and that they were not worthy of the gathering she had been sent to attend. She did not apologize in the Velhari word for apology, because in formal Velhari, the closest word carried connotations of defeat rather than acknowledgement. She used instead a phrase from the older form of the language, an expression that translated approximately as, "I name this error mine, and I set it in the record." It was a phrase from an older era of Velhari diplomatic culture, one that Dorveth later told 2 colleagues he had not heard used in a formal chamber in over 60 years. Then she said that she was formally endorsing, on behalf of the Velhari delegation, the reopening of trade discussions with the human delegation. She said this was not a concession. She said it was a recognition that the galaxy, in her observation over the past several days, appeared to function considerably better when its civilizations approached one another as equals in potential, regardless of how long each of them had been traveling among the stars. She stood at the speaking area for one more moment. Then she walked back to her seat and sat down. The chamber was still. Then Ambassador Grell of the Thorosi Collective began to applaud. He was faster this time than he had been in the Grand Hall 5 days ago, and this time, the applause that joined his was immediate and widespread. Not universal, because nothing in diplomacy ever was, but broad and genuine enough to fill the chamber with sound for nearly half a minute. Connor sat in the human delegations section and did not applaud because he was a party to what had just been said, and it would not have been appropriate. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and watched the chamber respond, and his expression was the same calm and level expression it always was, and if there was anything else in it, only Kara Novak, who was watching him from the corner of her eye, would have been able to identify it, and she chose not to say anything about it. After the session ended, the formal signing of the conclave's closing record took place in a side chamber. Connor signed on behalf of humanity, or he shook hands with 4 other lead envoys. He exchanged a few words with Ambassador Grell, who told him that this had been, without question, the most interesting grand conclave he had attended in 30 years. Connor told him that was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Grell said probably both and that the best ones usually were. In the corridor outside, Ethan appeared with 3 documents in his hands and the look of a man who had been quietly very busy. He told Connor that all 3 of the preliminary conversations they had started 4 days ago were still open, that 2 of them had progressed significantly, and that the Velhari had sent a formal request to resume discussion of the original trade terms through official channels that afternoon. Connor took the documents, looked through them quickly, and handed 2 of them back with notes. Kara walked with him toward the docking ring where the human vessel was berthed. She said that had been the most dramatic week of her career, without any competition. Connor told her to give it time. She laughed. On the transport from the station to their ship, the 3 of them sat in the small passenger cabin and watched Valindra Station shrink behind them through the rear window. The orange gas giant turned slowly below it, enormous and quiet. Ethan asked after a while whether Connor thought Seraphine would actually change. He asked it genuinely, the way a young person asks when they want an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. Connor thought about it. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he said he did not know. He said change was not something you could verify from a single moment, even a significant one. He said that what he did know was that a person who could stand up in a room full of everyone who mattered, at 19 years old, and say clearly that they had been wrong, that person had the basic materials to become something worth watching. Whether she did anything with it was up to her. Ethan said that was a fair answer. Connor said it was the only honest one. The transport docked with the human vessel. The corridors of the ship were familiar and small after 5 days on the station, and Connor walked them with the particular feeling of returning to something that fit. He stopped at the door to his quarters, and before he went inside, he looked back once down the corridor at nothing in particular. Then he went in. The door closed, and the ship began to move. And on Valindra Station, in the observation lounge on the upper ring, a young Velhari princess sat alone with the great orange gas giant below her and the deep black of open space in every direction, and she looked at the stars for a long time, thinking about the difference between power and strength, and what it might take to become someone who understood both.